Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Divino Niño wash processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Dolce Misterio, a wash processed Colombian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that there was a different coffee that prompted this H&S purchase. And that is, of course, this coffee right here, as not only is it a wash processed Mejorado from one of our favorite coffee roasters, but it also comes from a producer that we've never reviewed before. So it's safe to say that I was extremely interested in this coffee, and we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 60. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is also listed on H&S's ultralight side of their spectrum, which once again we align with being as some of the lightest roasted coffees from any American-based coffee roaster. And even with some interesting processing to this one is certainly no exception, as this one continued to skew on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 31, first impression, and if I recall correctly, this one was another coffee that they recommended at least 30 days of rest before starting it, so we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was immediately insanely sweet. Easily one of the sweetest experiences we've had from any coffee this entire year, as there's a very wild sugariness to it. And I'm not just saying in terms of wash processed coffees or Mejorado coffees, I'm saying in terms of any coffee that we've had this entire year, as it's sweeter than some of the more hyper and heavier processed coffees we've had as well. While it is crepe-like and it does have that pixie stick quality, the overall sweetness goes far beyond that, as it had a mixed berry jello or wild berry gummy feel to it as well, all of which present in a very clean sense given just how intense and out there this one was. So that was the first impression, and after that I did reach out to H&S and I asked them about the processing of this coffee, because even for me, even with this one being a Mejorado, I had a little bit of a difficult time believing that this one was a true wash processed coffee. And it sounds like it was fermented just a little bit longer, but even then it still, for the most part, passes as a wash processed coffee. So make of that what you will. That's kind of what I was alluding to when I mentioned the overall processing of this coffee, as it's just a little bit more intense than almost anything I've experienced from any other true wash processed coffee. Day 34 through the Chemex, and the coffee is a little less clean this time around, as it's still offering a very high level of berry intensity to it with a strong artificial sugary quality as well. While it is still very sweet, it's a little less so than the previous day, as the acidity is a little bit more prominent this time around. And if anything, it was actually quite a bit reminiscent of the Iris, which is a coffee that we had also reviewed from H&S last year as well, which we described a lot of the time as being reminiscent of Trix, given the combination of the very out there berry qualities, that kind of purple and pink feel to it with the graininess to go alongside it as well. So that's a little bit of what I was experiencing with this coffee, very berry in that sense once again. Day 37 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee is back to being overly wildly sweet, to the extent that it was probably a little bit sweeter than I would have necessarily hoped for, giving it shades of a much cleaner and intense Iris with that cereal grain feel once again, but also a very, very strong grape Kool-Aid feel with a solid level of clarity. And that can't be overstated, as even with this one being as intense, sweet, and out there as it was, it still kind of kept that line from being overly fermenty or overly heavy, as there's a little bit more tartness and brightness this time around, but the sweetness continues to remain the standout, as it was just so unbelievably sweet. Day 40 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and I was curious to see how this would turn out. So 17:1 at a 99 degrees Celsius with a more fine grind, and the coffee held up surprisingly well, as I fully expected it to lose a fair bit of its structure, as it does remain very reminiscent of the Iris with a much cleaner and intense sense to it in that regard. A very prominent sugary quality yet again, a little bit more graininess, so I did feel more of that when we pushed this coffee, but also still that very strong berry quality to it. So at this time, a little bit closer to that Iris, giving it that kind of Trix feel. Day 43 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and The coffee also continued to hold up well, and I was really surprised at just how well it held up when being pushed, as it still has a lot of the strong intensity without the very heavy processing feel to it. It's all presenting in a clean sense, void of that fermentiness, and that's the notes I'm continuing to write down, largely because I was surprised that it held from being overly heavy and overly intense in that regard. More of that strong grape Kool-Aid, sugary candy aspect to it in a sweet and relatively cleaner sense. And when it comes to that very strong berry quality, especially grape, especially given that grape Kool-Aid, it's so surprising to me that it wasn't overly heavy. And I keep going back to that largely because of just how much I expected it to continue to be that way. Day 46 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's back to offering a similar experience to our first impression, as it still held the line from being too heavy. So even with us continuing to work through this coffee, it still didn't get to the point where it was overbearing. Very strong sugary qualities to it, almost reminiscent of what I described as being energy drinks, given it has a very strong concentrated intensity overall. So we'll go ahead and move on to day 49 as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was probably the least impressive version of this coffee we've had, as it still has that extremely high level of sweetness, but it just has a little less cleanliness overall. So even with it being pushed with either brew method, V60, Chemex, for whatever reason, when we stuck to our standard recipe with the Chemex, it just seems to struggle a little bit. Opens as it cools down, but even then, nowhere near as good as any of the other days. And on day 52, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe. And it feels like the coffee might start to finally lose its structure, as it's still super intense, but a little less clean than some of the earlier days. Primarily heavy grape forward once again with that strong energy drink-like feel. So, and here on day 60, I can continue to see it trending in that direction, as I feel like maybe a little bit more time has kind of made this one a little bit more unstable than it was on some of the earlier days. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 3 level 5s. Let's go through those. And we'll start with the finish and the sweetness together at a level 5. I don't think that's really surprising. There's a very strong berry intensity to this one right from the onset, and given that I immediately knew that this one was going to score a level 5 in terms of the sweetness, it's not surprising that both those things did score at that level 5 mark. This is one of those sweeter qualities where it could have scored even higher. We're thinking level 6, possibly even a level 7, one of the sweetest coffees we've reviewed ever in general, especially for what's listed as being a wash processed coffee. So both of those at the level 5, more than justified, and we'll go ahead and accompany that with the berry fruit there at the level 5. Very heavy grape feel to it, very heavy mixed berry feel to it. It's got that just strong dark berry intensity to it throughout the entirety of this coffee, with a very strong artificial sugary sweetness. And given just how much we've continued to highlight and accentuate those notes throughout the entirety of this coffee, it really shouldn't be surprising that all of those things reach that level 5 mark. It's just super intense in that regard. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the level 4s. We'll actually start with the acidity level 4. The acidity is one of the most interesting parts to me about this coffee, largely because it's the most feedback I've heard from others about this coffee. They were really surprised about how bright the acidity to this one was, and I even heard that the additional bit of processing was primarily there to help with the acidity of this coffee, as when it comes to mejorados, they can fluctuate somewhere between the 3 and the 4. They're not usually the brightest out there, so this is once again a little atypical for a true wash processed mejorado, where it scored pretty high in terms of the overall brightness. Very strong in that sense, and something that I wasn't necessarily expecting going into it. I should state that going into this coffee, when I saw the notes on here, I had a hard time believing that it was going to be, I guess, clean, even with it being a wash processed coffee. Anytime I see these sort of notes on a coffee, I'm a little bit hesitant to believe that it's going to turn out clean, but to my surprise, it was cleaner, I guess, overall. Let's go ahead and move on though, as we do have the florality there at the level 4. If I recall correctly, I think one of the other notes they have listed on here is some sort of floral note. Yeah, the lily, but even then, it reminded me a lot of the florals that we received from the iris, as I continue to go back to that, as that was a pretty floral forward experience once again. So a lot of those darker florals as well in this one, presented in a perfumey sense, but still relatively clean. So make of that what you will. I think lily's probably a little further away than what I would feel from this coffee, as lily I usually associate with a cleaner floral quality within a coffee. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the citrus fruit level 3. I think it's just more of a generic citric quality to this one. I didn't come up with a great descriptor for that, but it seemed to be presented a little bit more on the later days of this coffee. As I kind of mentioned, it was losing a little bit of its structure, and a undefined citric quality was kind of creeping up on this one a little bit. Stone fruit level 3, and I was getting some darker stone fruit qualities to it as well. Given that there's a very dark sort of purple pink theme to this one, I can definitely see a little bit more of those plum-like qualities and characteristics to this coffee as well. Body level 3, that's going to be the last thing worth discussing. Well, one more thing after that. But body level 3, as it definitely still had plenty of texture to it. Pretty thick bodied, kind of surprising in that sense to go with this one, as well as when it comes to Mejorados, that's also something that fluctuates between a 2 and a 3. And then the final thing worth discussing, by far the most important thing worth discussing, the cleanliness level 4. It's clean enough, and that's what I will say is, if it wasn't so intense, there wouldn't be as much hesitancy to leave it there at that level 4 mark. But it goes to show that if a coffee still is pretty well defined in the characteristics that it does offer, without any sort of the fermentiness to it, even with the coffee being as intense as it is, it can score the level 4. I think it's such an anomaly to have this heavy of a berry forward coffee score a level 4, because in all actuality, in all reality, I would fully expect that to be a level 3 just because of how strong and deep that berry quality is to it. It's a little bit of a head scratcher to me. I didn't think a coffee could actually score level 5s in sweetness, finish, and berry fruit and still maintain a level, or level 5s in those, and then still maintain that level 4 in terms of cleanliness, but this coffee did. So this tasting was very much an anomaly, but I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. In the same way, I heard a lot of negative things about the Dolce Misterio. I also heard a lot of negative things about this coffee, as a lot of people struggled to get the same level of sweetness that I was experiencing from this coffee, but it's the same thing with the Dolce Misterio, where this one was about as blatant and straightforward from the first time that I brewed it that I'm not entirely sure what happened, and it's possible that there was even more variance with the coffees than a lot of people received from this version as well. As I mean, this one was so direct for me, and I don't really know what to make of the experiences that other people did have. But as far as the experience that I had on this coffee, it's probably a little bit more mixed than I might have expected based off of that first try. Now, I was just so blown away by that first impression that I thought it did have potential to be one of my favorite coffees that we had reviewed the entire year. But I think by the end, I felt that this one was probably a little bit too much, in the same way that some of the anaerobic or natural processed coffees can be interesting right from the onset. The more you continue to work with them, the more fatigue you can get from a coffee like those. And that was kind of the case with this one. As going into it, I was really impressed by the first couple of tries, but then towards the end, I was saying to myself that it was a little bit more overbearing than I might have expected, even if it did maintain that level of cleanliness. The only thing that I continued to think about every time I was going into this coffee was, is this going to be the day where it finally loses that structure? Is this going to be the day where it finally loses that level 4 in terms of cleanliness? And I would say at this point, we're pretty close to that. And by having not necessarily an overly clean presentation of a lot of characteristics that I have mixed feelings on in general, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that I have relatively mixed impressions of this coffee. But I do have to say, this one's easily one of the more wild and out there coffees as far as something that's listed as a wash processed coffee goes. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you liked Iris last year, I think this is a significantly better version of that coffee, because I found so many similarities between these two, especially in the way that they presented themselves for the overall profile of them. But outside of that, a lot of people were really taken away by the brightness of this one, as it is very bright, but for me, it's the sweetness. If you like your unbelievably intense and sweet coffees, then this one's a very good fit for you in that sense. If you like a lot of those heavier, darker berry qualities to it, then this one's also a very good fit, as I couldn't help but continue to go back to that strong grape Kool-Aid-like feel throughout the entirety of it, with a very intense artificial sugary quality. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Divino Niño, wash processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.